Exactly.
Okay, can't come in with water. Okay.
Yes, so it's really, I know, great stylist. No, that's
Please
the
take a
truth. He was
seat
unoriginal,
so we
wasn't
can
he?
get started with the program. My name is Jimena Valdez-Sessler, and I am the chair of the Temple Museum Committee. And on behalf of the committee members and our museum director, Sue Koletsky, we want to welcome everybody to this exciting program.
We'll see.
Although Rabbi Klein needs no introduction, it's not going to stop me from saying a couple of words about him. Well, where do I start? Well, I will say that he's a lifetime learner and educator. He has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Chicago. He has an impressive number of people that follow him on his weekly Torah study sessions, his weekly poetry sessions, his occasional pre-concert talks at the Cleveland Orchestra. You know, we'll have so much to learn from this Renaissance man. But he's not only that, he's a devoted sports follower. And I believe he's even been, he's done the first pitch of the Guardians. And so he's sought out in all different areas. And everybody in this community knows him not only for his rabbinical deliverances, but for everything else he delivers. So welcome, Rabbi Klein.
I want to also just thank you so much. Thank you, Jimena, and thank you for being here and coming out on this rather snowy day. And also I want to thank all the people that are live streaming this for being here with us. When we created the exhibition, Andy Warhol's Jewish Icons 10 Portraits in our Hartsmark Gallery, we wanted to do programming that would really feature all of the 10 personalities. And so we had a meeting with our rabbis and our cantor and our librarian, and we asked, well, who would be interested in doing which of these personalities? And I have to say that Rabbi Klein jumped right away in his quiet way and said, I'll do Kafka. And he's going to be doing another program as well, which is very generous of spirit of his. But he's our beloved rabbi. We love learning from you, and we know how dear Kafka is in your heart. So without anything else, I would love to introduce you, and please tell us about Kafka.
We'll do it. I think I might.
Oh, you're mic'd?
Yeah.
Okay. Well.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Jimena and Sue, for the lovely introduction. I only wish that most of it were true, but exaggerations are also welcome. Well, we had contemplated a couple of hours ago canceling this afternoon because of the treacherous roads and so on, and we decided to go right along with it, I think for two fundamental reasons. One, we're Clevelanders. We understand, and we're going to be out here pioneering on snowy roads. And also, fortunately, we have live stream. So we knew that those who were disinclined to come out could nevertheless participate in this afternoon session. So thank you to those who are here for doing this, and thank you for those who are live streaming for being with us as well. Thanks to Jimena and to Margie Moskowitz and to Sue for your great work at our museum, which is one of the most important elements of our congregational life and has been a part of us for 70 plus years. I think Abba Hillel Silver started the museum in 1950. Is that right? So it's been central to our identity and to our education and to our enjoyment for a long period of time. There are going to be some pictures up on the screen. Right now, I think you see, am I right, the Warhol picture? No, we're going to start with a picture of Kafka himself, which we thought we would bring, and the second one, full-blown Kafka on the street, which we thought would be useful by way of asking the question, how well did Andy Warhol capture something about Franz Kafka? Artistic license, of course, but also one of the things I do want to talk about this afternoon are some of the features of this particular portrait by Andy Warhol, which I think do display some important characteristics of Franz Kafka. I also want to thank James Stringer for working on the technology this afternoon, and though I'm going to embarrass him once again, my friend Dr. Jordan Tobin, without whom my life would not be nearly as smooth, I guess is the way to say it, as I think it is. I had a little technology computer crisis earlier this afternoon and called Jordan, and he was over before I got the phone hung up. So thanks, Jordan, for all you do for me. So here's what I'd like to accomplish this afternoon. I want to give an overview of Franz Kafka's life and work and what made him a singular 20th century figure. I want to explore a bit Kafka's interesting Jewish identity and to try to understand the way in which it's appropriate to call him a post-traditional Jew. Also, we want to think about the way in which, given that he's post-traditional, that he embraces and is interested in important categories of Jewish culture and religion, but that in many ways he problematizes them and turns them upside down. Categories like revelation, law, exegesis, which is just a fancy term for interpretation. Kafka is working with categories like this out of the Jewish tradition, but in new ways. And then, as I just said, we want to look at Warhol's Kafka and examine its particular features. So, about Franz Kafka, the preeminent scholarly authority on Jewish mysticism, Gershom Scholem, claimed in a 1974 lecture to the Bavarian Academy of the Arts, he claimed that there are only 3 books that he truly read over and over again. And as he puts it, with an open heart and in spiritual tension, which is a lovely phrase. These 3 books, he said, were the Bible, written in Hebrew, the book that stands at the moment of our spiritual origins. The second book is the Zohar, written in Aramaic, the Bible of Jewish mysticism, and according to Scholem, the one post-biblical traditional text that pushes interpretation to its most daring extremes. And the third book is, according to him, one set of books in German, the collected writings of Franz Kafka. The Bible, the Zohar, and Kafka. Franz Kafka, the exemplary Jewish modernist who raises fundamental questions. The question of revelation. Can we gain clear and compelling insight about what is true The question of law. Can we gain trust in the law and those who administer it? The question of interpretation. Can we ever get to the bottom of an issue through interpretation? Or are we really caught in endless interpretation, endless options, and even endlessness? Can we finally get to solid ground? What about Kafka's biography? He was born in Prague with Austrian citizenship in 1883. He died of tuberculosis in Austria at the age of 40 in 1924. He was the eldest child of 6 children. His 2 brothers, Georg and Heinrich, died in infancy when Franz was not yet 7. And he had 3 sisters. I'm going to give you their nicknames: Ellie, Vali, and Otla. Their given names were Gabriel, Valerie, and Otli, all 3 of whom were murdered in the Holocaust. His family was German-speaking Ashkenazi Jews. His father owned a very successful fancy goods store in the heart of Prague, where he employed 15 people. To his father, as some of you know, Kafka wrote a pained, searing letter in which he accused his father of emotional abuse, disorienting double standards, and constant disapproval. And as he says, he suffered mightily because of his father's authoritarian and demanding character. Evidently, he never sent that letter, nor, of course, did his father ever read it. He described his father as a true Kafka in strength, health, appetite, loudness of voice, eloquence, self-satisfaction, worldly dominance, endurance, presence of mind, and a deep understanding of human nature. You can see that he was ambivalent about his father. He admired many of his supreme and superb qualities, but also he was overwhelmed and intimidated by this man. His mother, who was the daughter of a prosperous businessman and more educated than her husband, was, according to Franz, quiet and shy, though she, as the years went on, increasingly sided with Franz's father over and against Franz himself. And because both of his parents regularly worked 12 hours a day, Franz had a lonely childhood. He was trained as a lawyer, worked long hours for an insurance company for 14 years, from 1908 to 1922. He excelled at these tasks working for the insurance company, but he did not enjoy them, and he resented, he says, every second that he wasted in the office. This meant, these long hours, that Kafka could write only in the evenings, which he regularly did, and sometimes throughout the night. As for his interesting relationship with women, Kafka's literary executor, Max Brod, wrote that, and I'm going to quote Brod, that Kafka was tortured by sexual desire, end quote. He was involved with several women, with Felice Bauer, to whom he was engaged, then unengaged, then re-engaged, then unengaged for good. He was also engaged to Julie Dvorak, very briefly, with Milena Jazensk, with whom he exchanged more than 100 letters, and in the last year of his life, he had some involvement with Dora Diamond. But Kafka himself never married. What about his relationship with Judaism? He became a bar mitzvah at 13, and then had no more Jewish education. He never enjoyed going to the synagogue, though he attended 2 or 3 or 4 times a year. In a recent article in the New Yorker, Becca Rothfield writes that Kafka was never especially pious, but he nevertheless took his cultural affinities seriously. He dabbled in Zionism, he studied Hebrew late in his life, and went out of his way to befriend members of a Yiddish troupe that had passed through Prague. And though his fiction makes no explicit mention or allusion to the plight of his people in particular, his fiction is full of perennial outsiders, filled with descriptions of senseless persecutions that cannot, according to this author, but recall the trials of the rural Jews from whom he was only 1 generation removed. Later in his life, however, he undertook a serious study of Hebrew, even contemplating emigrating to Israel. Let me talk now about his works. Kafka wrote 3 novels, America, The Trial, and The Castle, all of them left unfinished. In fact, The Castle ends mid-sentence. He wrote a number of short stories, including a long short story, Metamorphosis, and a voluminous correspondence with a variety of people. On his deathbed, he ordered his literary executor, Max Brod, to burn every piece of his writing, which Brod refused to undertake. Otherwise, had he done it, this would have been a very short lecture today. Let's look closely at some of his writings. So I want to first read the first couple of pages of his most famous book, The Trial, with its quite stunning opening sentence. Jeremy?
Weren't any of these things published by then? I mean, if they had been burned at that point, were they not out in the world?
I don't know the answer to that question, whether he had published in his lifetime or not. Anybody know?
His short stories.
His short stories were. Good. Not the novels. Good. Okay, good. So, someone must have been telling lies about Joseph K. For without having done anything wrong, he was arrested one fine morning. His landlady's cook, who always brought him his breakfast at 8 o'clock, failed to appear on this occasion. That had never happened before. Kay waited for a little while longer, watching from his pillow the old lady opposite, who seemed to be peering at him with a curiosity unusual even for her. But then, feeling both put out and hungry, he rang the bell. At once there was a knock at the door, and a man entered whom he had never seen before in the house. He was slim and yet well knit. He wore a closely fitting black suit furnished with all sorts of pleats, pockets, buckles, and buttons, as well as a belt, like a tourist's outfit, and in consequence looked eminently practical, though one could not quite tell what actual purpose it served. "Who are you?" asked Kay, half raising himself in bed, but the man ignored the question, as though his appearance needed no explanation, and merely said, "Did you ring?" "Anna is to bring me my breakfast," said Kay, and then studied the fellow silently and carefully, trying to make out who he could be. The man did not submit to this scrutiny for very long, but turned to the door and opened it slightly so as to report to someone who was evidently standing just behind it. He says Anna is to bring him his breakfast. A short guffaw from the next room came in answer, and it rather sounded as if several people had joined in. Although the strange man could not have learned anything from it that he did not know already, he now said to Kay, as in passing, "It can't be done." "This is news indeed," cried Kay, springing out of bed and quickly pulling on his trousers. "I must see what people these are next door and how Frau Grubach can account to me for such behavior." Yet it occurred to him at once that he should not have said this out loud, and by doing so, he had in a way admitted the stranger's right to superintend his actions. Still, that didn't seem important to him at the moment. The stranger, however, took his words in some sense, for he asked, "Hadn't you better stay here?" "I shall neither stay here nor let you address me until you have introduced yourself." "I meant well enough," said the stranger, and then of his own accord threw the door open. In the next room, which Kay entered more slowly than he had intended, everything looked at first glance almost as if it had the evening before. It was Frau Grubach's living room. Perhaps among all the furniture, rugs, china, and photographs with which it was crammed, there was a little more free space than usual, and yet one did not perceive that at first, especially as the main change consisted in the presence of a man who was sitting at the open window reading a book from which he now glanced up. "You should have stayed in your room. Didn't Franz tell you that?" "Yes, but what are you doing here?" asked Kay, looking from his new acquaintance to the man called Franz, who was still standing by the door, and then back again. Through the open window, he had another glimpse of the old woman who was truly senile, and with senile inquisitiveness had moved along to the window exactly opposite. Somebody is watching. In order to go on seeing all that could be seen. "I'd better get Frau Grubach," said Kay, as if wrenching himself away from the two men, though they were standing at quite a distance from him and making as if to go out. "No," said the man at the window, flinging the book down on the table and getting up. "You can't go out. You are arrested." "So it seems," says Kay. "But what for?" he added. "We are not authorized to tell you that. Go to your room and wait there. Proceedings have been instituted against you, and you will be informed of everything in due course. I am exceeding my instructions in speaking freely to you like this." This is strange writing. It creates, it seems to me, a sense of mystery, a sense of eeriness. Something is up here, of anxiety. When Kay learns that he is arrested, he accepts it with some equanimity, as if to illustrate the idea that really he has a feeling of guilt all along. Guilt, we might say, as part of the modern condition. There is a sense of alienation here. Who are these people? Who's that woman across the street? Why are there proceedings being undertaken against him? Even a sense of menace, which I think is somewhat different from danger, something mysterious about the source of the menace that one feels without being actually able to point to. As the novel progresses, Kay can never get to the bottom of the accusation against him, or even how close the proceedings were to its conclusion. In other words, what Kafka has done here is to create a picture of a system of seemingly arbitrary, unbending, unresponsive authority, in which Joseph K., initial K, of the trial is entrapped. If we move to the end of the trial in its second last chapter, the very famous description with the title, Before the Law. I want to read a part of that as well. But the setup is this. An agent from a satellite office of Kay's business is coming to town and wants a tour of the city, and especially of the cathedral. And so Kay decides he's going to meet him there at a certain hour. That hour arrives, the man is not there. He waits another 15 minutes, the man is not there. So Kay himself decides to go in to the church and look around. He sees a verger, a church official, who takes him down the aisle of the pews where a priest in the darkness of the cathedral was standing and staring at Kay. Kay felt, for some reason, as the priest ascends the lectern, that a sermon is about to be preached, but no one else is in the church. And he feels that in some uncanny way, this sermon is going to be meant for him. It was absurd, the author says, to think that a sermon was going to be preached at 11 in the morning on a weekday in such dreadful weather. And so frightened and confused, Kay begins to flee from the church, walking to the back, just as the priest was beginning his sermon. But as Joseph Kay arrived at the door, out of the blue, eerily, the priest calls out, "Joseph Kay." How does the priest know it's Joseph Kay? How is it that the guest who Joseph Kay was going to escort around the community doesn't show up? How come the priest is staring at the bottom of the front of the sanctuary, staring at Joseph Kay? So I want to read a little bit of this very telling chapter. Kay paused after being called Joseph Kay and stared at the ground before him. For the moment, he was still free. He could continue on his way and vanish through one of the small, dark wooden doors that faced him at no great distance. It would simply indicate that he had not understood the call, or that he had understood it and didn't care, not turning around, not acknowledging the priest. But if he were to turn around, he would be caught, for that would amount to an admission that he had understood it very well, that he was really the person addressed, and that he was ready to obey. The story continues, where the priest is now delivering this so-called sermon to Joseph Kay himself. In the writings which preface the law, that particular delusion is described thus. Before the law stands a doorkeeper. To this doorkeeper there comes a man from the country who begs for admittance to the law. But the doorkeeper says that he cannot admit the man at the moment. The man, on reflection, asks if he will be allowed then to enter later. "It's possible," answers the doorkeeper, "but not at this moment. Since the door leading to the law," think of the law as Torah, "since the door leading into the law stands open as usual, and the doorkeeper steps to one side, the man bends down to peer through the entrance. When the doorkeeper sees that, he laughs and he says, 'If you are so strongly tempted, try to get in without my permission. But note that I am powerful, And indeed, I am only the lowest of the doorkeepers. From hall to hall, keepers stand at every door, one more powerful than the other. And the sight of the third man is already more than even I can stand. You get the picture here of something of a cave with an opening, and the doorkeeper and Kay are standing at the cave, and Kay is trying to see through to get some access to the law. But the doorkeeper says, even if you start getting in, it's going to be more and more formidable. These are difficulties which the man from the country has not expected to meet. The law, he thinks, should be accessible to every man and at all times. But when he looks more closely at the doorkeeper in his furred robe with his huge pointed nose and long, thin Tartar beard, he decides that he had better wait until he gets permission to enter. The doorkeeper gives him a stool and lets him sit down at the side of the door. There he sits for days and years. He makes many attempts to be allowed in and wearies the doorkeeper with his importunity. The doorkeeper often engages him in brief conversation, asking him about his home and about other matters. But the questions are put quite impersonally, as great men put questions, and always conclude with the statement that the man cannot be allowed to enter yet. One question which occurs to this reader is, why didn't he just go in? Why is he feeling so passive? The man who has equipped himself with many things for his journey parts with all he has, however valuable, in the hope of bribing the doorkeeper to let him in. The doorkeeper accepts it all, saying, however, as he takes each gift, I take this only to keep you from feeling that you have left something, that you have not left something undone. During all those long years, the man watches the doorkeeper almost incessantly. He forgets about the other doorkeepers, and the one seems to him the only barrier between himself and the law. In the first years, he curses his evil fate aloud. Later, as he grows old, he only mutters to himself. He grows childish, and since in his prolonged study of the doorkeeper, he has learned to know even the fleas in his fur collar. And he begs the very fleas to help him and to persuade the doorkeeper to change his mind. Finally, his eyes grow dim, and he doesn't know whether the world is really darkening around him or whether his eyes are only deceiving him. The question of interpretation. What is it that is causing this darkness? There's this alternative, there's this alternative. Can he really come to discover what it is? But in the darkness, he can now perceive a radiance that streams inextinguishably from the door of the law. Now his life is drawing to a close. He spent his whole life here. Before he dies, all that he has experienced during the whole time of his sojourn condenses in his mind into one question, which he has never yet put to the doorkeeper. He beckons the doorkeeper, since he can no longer raise his stiffening, dying body. The doorkeeper has to bend far down to hear him, for the difference in size between them has increased very much to the man's disadvantage. What do you want to know now? Asked the doorkeeper. You are insatiable. Everyone strives to attain access to the law, answers the man. How does it come about then that in all these years no one has come seeking admittance but me? The doorkeeper perceives that the man is nearing his end, and his hearing is failing, so he bellows in his ear, no one but you could gain admittance through this door. Since this door was intended only for you, I am now going to shut it. Now, when we come to the synagogue or come to study Torah, Torah is right here in front of us. We don't have to beg for access. What Kafka is suggesting here is the inaccessibility now of the sources of Torah, Torah meaning teaching, wisdom. Those are closed off. Well, a question arises. What does this parable mean? It could mean several things. It could mean that perhaps there is no law, that the doorkeeper is dissembling. He says there's a law, but in point of fact, there is no law. That is, no revelation is any more possible. There is no truth. That's one kind of interpretation of this parable. On the other hand, perhaps there is law, perhaps there is Torah, but nevertheless, it is now inaccessible to us. It no longer speaks to us. It no longer lives in and with us. We can no longer make sense of it for our own day. You see how an author like Kafka is trying to understand something about our own climate, our own culture, and the things that seemed natural and accessible in former centuries are now problems for us. I want to take a look at a passage by Kafka scholar Saul Friedlander, who writes about this particular passage. Friedlander's book, The Poet of Shame and Guilt. When we consider the plot, we recognize the repetitive use of a central element, the existence of an unidentified source of threat and ill omen. In the trial, the accused, Joseph K., and the people around him never get the slightest glimpse of the higher authority that rules over the courts, that issues the arrest warrant and dictates the outcome of the judicial process. Where was the judge, K shouts, before his execution? He's executed at the end, whom he had never seen. Where was the high court to which he had never penetrated? And what was the law? In The Castle, his last novel, the supreme authority recognized by all but never seen and never described is as abstract and as blindly potent as the law or the supreme judge in the trial. And then Friedlander asks this question: are we facing here an absent God, a hidden evil demiurge, or blind fate? What is it that kind of pervades the atmosphere of these stories as its unattainable source? Are we facing here an absent God in our day, of which this is a parable, or some evil force, or even blind fate itself? So what we have here is, again, a story of uncanniness, a sense that something is going on that we cannot fathom, that we cannot get our hands, our arms, and our minds around. Something menacing, something inaccessible, something problematic. I want to read something from a book by Robert Alter about Kafka's other novel, or another of his novels, and that is The Castle. This is a wonderful book for those of you who are interested, with the title Necessary Angels, and the subtitle is Tradition and Modernity in Kafka, Walter Benjamin, and Gershom Scholem. I'm reading from page 76. The last of the three novels, The Castle, is the most striking instance of a world suffused with and perhaps also corroded by exegesis, by interpretation, endless interpretation. In the opening pages, Kay has secretly arrived at the inn, and he overhears a certain young man named Schwarzer in a phone conversation with the castle, referring to Kay as the land surveyor, the very identity he himself has been trying to establish. He gets to the foot of the hill. The castle is at the top of the hill. It's a dark night. Can't even see the castle. Is there a castle there at all? And he identifies himself as the land surveyor who has been hired to come and do something for the castle. And he's been trying to convince the people down below that he is the person. The use of this single term sends him into an exegetical whirl. Quoting, Kay pricked up his ears. So the castle recognized him. This official calls the castle, and they say, yes. Oh, he says, so the castle has recognized him as the land surveyor. That was unpropitious for him, on the one hand, for it meant that the castle was well informed about him and had estimated all the probable chances and was taking up the challenge with a smile. We know all about him. That's his first conjecture about the call that he overhears. Yes, we do know him. On the other hand, it was quite, the first was unpropitious because they recognized him. On the other hand, he conjectures, it was quite propitious, for if his interpretation was right, they had underestimated his strength, and he would have more freedom of action than he dared hope. And if they expected to cow him by their lofty superiority and recognize him as the land surveyor, they were mistaken. It made his skin prickle a little. That was all. So, at the beginning of this novel, before we get a succession of events, we're already deeply involved in the process of interpretation. What does this call mean? They recognize him as the land surveyor. They don't recognize him. So before the facts are even begun to be established, interpretations proliferate. On the one hand, on the other hand, and he never really gets to the bottom of it. Think of what happens in the trial. Constant questioning, constant searching for, what did I do wrong? What's my offense? Who are you? Who's authorized you? Question after question in an attempt over and over again to make some sense of it without ever really getting quite to the bottom of it. And this is one of the issues that Kafka, I think, is deeply concerned about. Can we ever find solid ground? Or is it just a matter of, it might be this, it might be that, it might be the other thing? His famous long short story, Metamorphosis, and I want to read the beginning. One morning, as Gregor Samsa was waking up from anxious dreams, he discovered that in bed he had been changed into a monstrous bug. He lay on his armor-hard back and saw, as he lifted his head up a little, his brown arched abdomen divided up into rigid bow-like sections. From this height, the blanket, just about ready to slide off completely, could hardly stay in place. His numerous legs, pitifully thin in comparison to the rest of his circumference, flickered helplessly before his eyes. What's happened to me, he thought. It was no dream. His room, a proper room for a human being, only somewhat too small, lay quietly between the four well-known walls. Above the table on which an unpacked collection of sample cloth goods was spread out, Samsa was a traveling salesman, hung the picture which he had cut out of an illustrated magazine a little while ago, set in a pretty gilt frame. It was a picture of a woman with a fur hat and a fur boa. She sat erect there, lifting up in the direction of the viewer a solid fur muff into which her entire forearm disappeared. So notice what Kafka has accomplished here. Something preposterous has happened, and yet he describes it in the same narrative flow as he would any other event, okay? Something is wrong, but it's not written as if it is wrong. There's something absurd about this. Samsa's body has been transformed, but not his mind. He is still thinking and contemplating what has happened to me and so on. What about the blanket? As if nothing really out of the ordinary has happened. And Samsa goes on to accept his new life. He neither asks why this has happened, nor does he complain about it, nor does he seek to change it. And he is, after all, a traveling salesman and a responsible person. Why has this happened? There's no attempt at an explanation. It's a world out of joint. And finally, the family has to hide him. They finally abandon him, and he dies a kind of ignominious death. Another sense of the absurd, of something is wrong, something is out of joint in our world. His letter to his father, I want to read the opening paragraph of that. Dearest Father, you asked me recently why I maintain that I'm afraid of you. As usual, I was unable to think of any answer to your question, partly for the very reason that I'm afraid of you, and partly because an explanation of the grounds for this fear would mean going into far more details than I could even approximately keep in mind while talking, right? The anxiety, the fear conjoined with anxiety. If I start to tell you, I might get so choked up that I'm not even able to talk about it. And if I now try to give you an answer in writing, this business of alternatives, how shall I approach this fear I have? Shall I say something to you? Shall I write it down? And if I now try to give you an answer in writing, it will still be very incomplete, because even in writing, this fear and its consequences hamper me in relation to you. And because the magnitude of the subject goes far beyond the scope of my memory and my power of reasoning. So the breakdown of communication, I am not even able to tell you, dearest Father, is how he begins the letter, what it is he feels, as if there is really no longer any shared system of understanding, of communication. So disparate are these two people. So something of a summary of some of his writings and some of the important issues and ideas that he deals with. In my particular copy of the trial, each chapter is prefaced, so to speak, with a drawing. Now, there's chapter 1, a drawing. And I have a book here with the title Franz Kafka, The Drawings, with an introductory essay and with some interpretive essays, and then throughout the book, various ways in which he wrote things down, letters and illustrations and so on. What I'd like to do is to show some of these and to make some comments about them. and to see also what you think of them. So let's look at them one at a time. Okay, so you see on, so you see on the left a very severe angular figure, and you see on the right, in the smaller picture, that the man is enclosed in something like a fence, okay? So, there it is. Oh, very, very good. I see what you're saying. You're prefacing the next one on the right. So let's go back to the first one. So we see a human being distorted. It's almost like a stick figure, a very straight, I'm pointing to this one here, the straight leg, the man leaning on the table with a kind of rectangular figure, so that it's almost as if this figure, though recognizably human, has been distorted and becoming something else. Do you notice this one with the man at the table doesn't get it quite as much? Let's go to the next one. This one very much reminds me of the trial, where he is enclosed in a figure here, although the fence is low enough for him just to climb out of it. Why doesn't he take the initiative and escape rather than wallowing or being satisfied with his passivity? So there's both enclosure and not, as if somehow our environment today constrains us in ways that perhaps it didn't in former times, but perhaps there is a way out. Do you notice that the figure is not grounded, not standing on anything solid? The figure is also, let's go to the next one, please. This is really a lovely, powerful drawing. This is almost a full abstraction of a human figure. We see one line moving from the lower right to the upper left. And this looks like a fencer who is, what do you call this? Parrying? If you look closely at it, there is a space between the arm and the sword, as if this figure is in motion and going where. But once again, the figure is ungrounded, seems to be floating, isolated, alone, not facing, none of these figures is facing us, so that there's a sense of social isolation and loneliness and a kind of an antisocial or a non-social stance. So it seems to me that these drawings, and there are 6 of them. Jordan, can we move on just a little bit? Yeah, there they all are together. We've looked at this one, the man at the table. All of these figures are, in some sense, abstracted, not grounded, facing away from us, isolated and alienated. So I don't know much about these drawings. One scholar who wrote the introduction to this suggests that at some point early in his career as a writer, he stopped writing for some reason and turned to drawing, as if he is trying with 2 different media to capture the same ideas that he was interested in. I'm wondering if you have some other thoughts about these drawings, thoughts about what they might mean. Yeah, Maya?
I think that when you're talking about his writing and the drawings, maybe 2 words come to my mind. One is the absurd that you refer to, and the one is angst.
Yeah, anxiety.
And I think that that here, both of them are demolitions.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Tension. Oh, yes, that both the absurdity of the situation and also a sense of anxiety. I've added the word tension, which I see as somewhat of a synonym here. There is a sense of alienation too, isn't there? That these people are not connected in any way. They're kind of enclosed in themselves. Margie?
It also makes me think, as with the writing, that Gregor Samsa and Joseph K., in their minds, they believe in their human freedom, when in reality, it's an illusion.
Yeah.
And you can see the parallel in some of those drawings.
Good. There's a sense of inner freedom, but don't have it, actually, in the social world. And that's certainly what the trial suggests. Something is going on, there's a process, there's a judge, there are witnesses, but we don't have any idea what it is. There's a kind of a suffocating sense about the modern world, if I could say it that way. Any other thoughts about these drawings? Yes, Kathy?
What year were they done? And how did they line up with his writings and with with World War I?
I don't really know. I know that he got to his writing somewhat early, that in the second half of the first decade of the 20th century, 1905, 1907 is when he started. How long he did it? I mean, you can see from this, he does this in a variety of ways. I mean, he writes on paper. I'm just skipping around here. He doodles. There are other of these kind of stick drawing figures. There is one that I should have noted where he's actually drawing something of a story, but I don't know quite when these things happen. Cindy? Oh, that's interesting. So there's a fragileness about them. Good, nice. Margie?
Question for you. When you're talking about the anxiety of the world, how much do you think this has to do with the precariousness of being a Jew?
Say that again, ask that again.
You were talking in a broad sense about the anxiety of the modern world that he's in. And I'm asking you, how much do you see the precariousness of being Jewish and feeling accused or not comfortable?
Does Kafka see? Do I see it? Yeah, right.
Specifically addressing being Jewish.
I think that as Jews in the modern world, we have two quite different feelings, at least I do. A sense of security, a sense of belonging in this world in which we live, but always a kind of penumbra on the margins of, the rise of anti-Semitism again today reminds us that some of these hatreds are just a little bit below the surface and can break out again. Even though I must confess that I feel very much at home in my environment in Cleveland, in Ohio, in America, with a sense a little bit gnawing, it doesn't gnaw at me too much, that malevolence is out there. We do talk about eternal anti-Semitism that will not go away for a variety of reasons. Yeah, Candy?
Would you like to comment on why Andy Warhol picked Franz Kafka?
Yes. So my understanding is, Sue, you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, that he himself did not make the choices. This was made for him by a museum director in Washington, D.C. Is that right? I'm sorry? He did not pick the 10 subjects, but of course the interpretations are his. Yes, Jimena?
Saying that he did pick the subjects. Many were proposed to him.
I see what you mean.
And then among those, I think
Yeah.
the faces he thought were interesting without really thinking too far down about what they represent.
That's an interesting point. So you think it's more a design and aesthetic than a substantive. I want to make a little case for the substantive appropriateness of this particular picture. I want to make 4 points about what Warhol has done here. First of all, if you look at all of the 10 portraits, some of them have backgrounds and some of them do not. And the way I might want to understand that is some of them, the faces are right up against the surface of the picture. And so they block out any kind of background. There are some portraits which have some background. I mean, Einstein has some background, some darkness, and that may reflect, I'm not sure if Warhol was onto this, but one of the predictions of the general law of relativity by Einstein was the existence of dark matter and of black holes. Now, is this what Warhol is trying to depict in the black background behind the Einstein? But the portrait with the most black background is Kafka himself. And it seems to me that this represents, now you'll think maybe I'm overreading, the darkness of Kafka's world, the emptiness of the world in which he lives, an emptiness that has replaced something which was at one point there. It's the issue about the law. Is it there but obscured, or is it not there at all? And one could say the darkness represents one or the other. The emptiness suggests to me that something is missing and that we have a kind of threatening penumbra around the figure itself. Kafka seems in this portrait to be isolated, just like those particular drawings isolated the individuals. It's not as if, I mean, in some of the other portraits, I mean, you look at the Marx brothers, of course, they're brothers, and so they're all going to be there. But it's the depiction of something interpersonal and social. I think Kafka's isolation in this particular portrait is the most poignant of the isolations of any of the figures. That's the first point I want to make about it. The second point is that there is a feeling here of, at least maybe it's the black background, of disorientation, of malaise. I like especially the line bisecting his face, which I think reflects something of the dualities that exist in Kafka's world. Himself and his father, himself and the women of his life, traditional categories of revelation, of law, of interpretation, and the way in which those categories don't figure as powerfully in the modern world. His concern for origins, Torah, law, and contrasted with their manifestation in the modern world. So I think the line down the center represents Kafka's divided self, or the divided self of the modern world between two poles, being at home, not being at home, and so on in a variety of ways. Finally, there's this streak of yellow light that goes, it's not exactly as prominent there. And that streak of light suggests that in some way there is illumination that comes out of this figure. Why do we read him? Why do we continue to read him? He has illuminated some of the malaise, some of the problems of our society when contrasted, and this is his modernism. Think about modernist novels. Think about a novel by Faulkner. If you've read Absalom, Absalom, you recognize that his aunt, is it his aunt who is describing the story of the family? And it turns out, as the novel progresses, that you see that the aunt is distorting the picture as other interpretations of this phenomenon begin to emerge. So that the narrative line of classical literature is now broken into parts and so on. So, comments, questions about any of this? Vivian?
This painting, in the way it's hanging, strikes me. I mean, what strikes you first is the gaze, and of course it's accentuated by the streak of light. But the gaze lets you in and invites you into this world of his, or suggests the universality of the condition.
Interesting. So the gaze, Vivian is saying, draws us into this picture. What was the second thing you said just at the end?
I'm just saying it lets you in.
Yeah, right.
Or invites you to see well, first of all, his humanity. And there's a smirk in
Yeah.
which, it depends on, I mean, I don't know if you would entertain in his writing humor,
Uh-huh.
particularly in
Metamorphosis, yeah.
I mean, there's this yin and yang and this tension between anxiety and absurdity.
Yeah, very good. Alan?
I think he's looking at us contemptuously.
You think he's what?
He's looking at us contemptuously.
You think there's contempt in his stare. Mm-hmm. Notice that he's not looking like this, he's sort of looking like this. A look which is a kind of noticing, as if he has turned aside to notice something. And noticing is the recognition of something that doesn't appear at first blush to us. We have to look again. You remember Moses turned aside to notice why the bush doesn't burn? Noticing is different from looking straight on. So there is that. Yes, Maida, yes.
I think he has the most penetrating of all those 10 portraits. He is really looking at us. And I think it came right directly from the photograph. I think Warhol really used photographs to impose on the stone that he was printing on it. But if you look, the collar of the shirt is not where his neck would be. His face is not quite in that shirt. He is looking at us to bring us into his world.
Very good. Again, the stare that draw.
I think it's a stare. I think it's a
Penetrating, yeah.
gaze. I think it's
That's your point, Alan, I think, about contemptuous. Yeah, there's something of a bit of an indictment in his look. We'll go that far, Maida?
But look at the photographs and look at how close to the photograph that
Can we go back to that first photograph? Yeah. So we're making the case here a little bit, it seems to me, that of course there are design elements, but also there's something quite substantive in this depiction about this person as we see him. There it is.
photograph is not the photograph that this was taken from.
Oh, is that true?
Another photograph.
Okay, very good, very good. Vivian?
Here you see that penetrating gaze, look, if you want to. I mean, he is involved in that communication.
Look how many interpretations we have of that look, a stare, or something contemptuous, inviting us in, penetrating. Yeah. Vivian, did you have a comment?
I think that Warhol, I may be wrong, but I think he took the photograph from Kafka's portrait with his first fiancée.
Oh, okay.
So,
Felice, was that Felice?
yes. I mean, this is another portrait, but the angle, and so there's a lot of ambiguity in that. And that is supposedly a happy photograph.
Nice, nice, nice. Sue? Speak a little louder, Sue.
So these 10 people in the portfolio were all deceased. Normally, you're absolutely right that Warhol would take pictures and then his own pictures he would use for paintings and print and silkscreens.
I can't hear her either.
Portfolio, all 10 of these people were deceased, and his assistants at the
Sue, how about coming forward and saying that? I can't hear you either. Microphone?
Thanks. Okay, so for this portfolio, all of the people were deceased. And under other circumstances, definitely Warhol took photographs and used his photographs for his prints and his paintings. That was what he was very well known for. So his assistants these were printed in 1980, so probably a few years before, did the research, got the archival photographs from newspapers, from different people who had taken photographs, and they're credited. Like when you go into the gallery, which I hope you will go into, there in the left, it will have an information as part of the portfolio that tells you where these photographs originated from. And so part of the process was that they looked at a variety of archival photographs. And because Warhol was the artist, and he was the one who was really gravitating to the image that he wanted to use and that excited him for these, he probably had several to choose from, and then he would select the the photograph that he wanted to work from. And in all of these, it's hard to see this in here, but when you go into the gallery, you'll see that the photograph was enlarged, and you can see the halftone of the photograph as one of the screens. So he used the halftone from the photograph, then he took the photograph and enlarged it with an opaque projector and used graphite to do all the hand drawing, which is so beautiful because you see the artist's hand and their energy and their artistic creativity, and that's really what makes these come alive as well. And then after that is when he used color-aid papers, and you can see they're kind of sometimes in rectangular form and triangular, and then he had the colors, the blocks of colors on top of it. So it's those kind of three elements all together that make these dynamic pieces so rigorous and so exciting. He used many colors and many screens for each one of them. And again, those are also delineated in each of the, each piece is different. So if you want to find out exactly how many screens were used for this or how many colors were on this print, that's in the exhibition as well.
So how did the 10 that he chose, was he given more than 10 possibilities and chose 10 from that?
So yes. So
and then picked the way in which he wanted to portray each one from
so
what
there was
pictures?
a large conversation with his gallerist, Feldman, who proposed the idea of doing the 10 portraits to begin with. And he was kind of his manager and marketer. They worked very closely together, and they came up with a list of almost 100 different people. And we have that in the gallery as well. Some of them were not Jewish, some of them were like alive. That was not what they were doing. So there was conversation, a very heated conversation about who these 10 people were going to be. And at one point, Warhol really wanted to have Modigliani, the Italian artist, as one of the 10 because the image of his face was so beautiful. So they probably had the assistants looking for many images, and they worked together to look at the images and also the people. And Feldman himself preferred to have Louis Brandeis because he was actually an attorney as well, and he wanted to show in this portfolio the importance of having a Jewish Supreme Court justice. And so they had a somewhat heated conversation apparently, and in this case, Warhol didn't win out because Modigliani is not part of this portfolio, but Louis Brandeis is. And he worked with that portrait. So Warhol was the artist. He was the one who was looking at images and what excited him and the colors and all. And that, is very important in looking at the history of how this kind of image became.
Nice. Very good.
It would be very special to think that Warhol would have had the resources to understand who Kafka really was. I mean, he wouldn't have understood the theological thing, the background, and the fact is the guy probably was mentally ill. He may have been schizophrenic, they're not really sure. He didn't really finish his work. He was definitely off, but he did manage, even without knowledge, to capture some of the spaciness and the oddness of the person. Because he could be looking at you, but he couldn't be looking at you. You have no idea who, he's not really, he's looking at something, I agree, but I don't find this anyone where I engage a person like that. He doesn't look friendly. Is he someone who you look over and talk to? You think who knows, right? I don't think Warhol would have gotten nearly into the depth of his work to get those.
But he did capture something, didn't he?
We're speculating. I think it's random myself, but it's amazing he did that.
Well, he definitely looked at the images, and he definitely got a lot of information from all the people that were giving him information to make these decisions. So it was a collaboration.
It was a collaboration.
It was a
Yeah.
collaboration.
Maya?
So the interpretation keeps continuing.
There you go.
We are bringing our stuff into that, and I think that you can look at it and you can see fragmentation also
Yes.
as a theme. I mean, and there is opacity and there is transparency here. So I think that's the beauty. You started with interpretation and we continue. So
Very good.
whether Warhol was aware of it or not, we still can project our.
Nice. So Maya's suggesting not only another component, the fragmentation, which I don't think we've mentioned yet, but also that in a way this is emblematic of something that is important to him, the ongoingness, the endlessness of interpretation. I mean, you know what, just to say it as an aside, there is a kind of structure to Jewish textuality, I might say. What we have, for example, the Bible, which is a very expansive literature. And then early in the rabbinic period, it narrows down to something much more discernible, a set of laws, for example. Then the Talmud opens it up again to multiplicity and ambiguity. Then the later rabbis take that multiplicity and narrow it back down to codes of law. So that in the Jewish tradition, there is this sense of almost the infinity of interpretation. But since we're dealing not just with something intellectual, philosophical, but a community, that spaciousness of interpretation needs to be narrowed down to a particular set of interpretations, so that Kafka is talking about the endlessness of interpretation, whereas a tradition like Judaism, Christianity too, we have to have order within community. And so there needs to be at some point the reining in of the multiplicity of interpretation. So it goes back and forth between these two. I think of it in terms of the systole and the diastole. The blood goes out, expands into the body, it comes back to gather new energy and so on. Yeah, Maida?
What he has done here also is to use opposites. The orange and the blue are opposite colors, so that he's embracing and expanding on the fact that this man is dealing with reality and maybe not reality. And I love the fact that one ear is outlined, so to speak, such that it's hearing something more than what the world may be hearing. I mean, there's just a lot of of juxtaposition of things. The straight line of the gold going up, just not quite embracing the mouth, but over the mouth, as if you can't really speak.
That's interesting.
I mean, they're just, all those opposites are at play here.
Yep. So Maida's pointing to the opposites, the contrasts within the picture itself. Yeah, the portrait itself. Yes, Joan?
I use the microphone so that people online can hear the questions. I haven't read, I can speak loudly.
No, we can't.
No.
Online can't hear. Can you hear me now? What bothers me, I haven't read his novels, but I'm bothered that they're incomplete. And are they really incomplete? Did he mean for them to not, to end the way they have?
Right.
Because when you can look at a painting, and some artists are, if they see their painting in your home, they touch it up or do something. You know, they're never done. And they've never
Right.
completed what they
So
started.
I don't know the answer to that, and yet, as I understand it, the castle ends in mid-sentence. That would seem to be accidental. I mean, that wouldn't seem to be part of the plan. I mean, anything can be part of a plan, I suppose. So I don't know the answer to it. You know, there's this parallel question about Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. Was it intentional? Was he diverted to some other project? Was this the notion of the completeness of incompleteness? That would be sort of a philosophical approach to it. Life is always incomplete, and so one wants an incomplete symphony. And so is it accidental or is it intentional, is your question. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, well, let's just see if there are others who want to say something. Yes. Okay. Go ahead, yeah.
So, okay, can we go back to his long story, The Metamorphosis, which I had to read in college, and I still don't really understand what it was supposed to be about. Can you kind of summarize what your feeling was about that?
About how the story unfolds?
No, about what he's trying to say in it.
What's interesting about it to me is that it's a totally absurd situation rendered in the kind of prose that one would expect to accompany something quite intelligible, so that the form and structure, the literary structure and the elements of it, in a way belies what is happening. How can you be describing the person waking up one morning and being, aren't you astonished? Shouldn't this story be filled with exclamation points? How could this happen? And yet it's very placidly written. So I think he's trying to describe an absurd, the uncanniness, the uncanny elements of our lives in a way that makes them seem real. Because the language is not exclamatory, it's descriptive. And you see what happens to him in the family. The family is embracing him, and they're bringing food, and then they're embarrassed about it, and they become more alienated. They close his door. They begin to have so the family is reacting to this, but very, very gradually, to the grotesqueness of the situation.
Okay.
I just have a lingering question about that he wanted everything destroyed. And did Max Brod write about his sort of mental state? Was he depressed, or did he not believe in himself? Or do we know any more about it?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I conjecture, maybe somebody knows, that Max Brod said, my gosh, this is a treasure. We can't just destroy this. This is literature of great significance and great artistry. That's my inference without knowing. Does anybody know?
What I read is that he was very dissatisfied with his produced work. And so I think that that's what led him to ask that he be destroyed. He didn't, I don't think he had a sense of worthiness about his work.
You don't think what?
I don't think he felt it was worthwhile preserving.
Well, I thought your question was about Max Brod himself.
He was very self-critical, and he
Kafka,
was...
sure. Yeah. And I wonder if he felt it was too self-revelatory. I mean, this letter to his father, it's an indictment of the father, which, yeah.
Rabbi, how did he die?
He died of tuberculosis.
Just natural causes then, yeah. I mean,
He had a very rare form of tuberculosis.
Okay, very good. Was he in a
Tuberculosis of
sanatorium?
the larynx, which affected not only breathing, but his ability to eat. It was a horrifying end.
Right. In how many audiences would we know the answer to what kind of tuberculosis? Thank you very much. Maida? Oh, no, question back there.
If you go and look at literature to answer the question, why did he want to burn his thing?
Yes.
If you go and you look at a wide circumference of literature, many, many brilliant people who were not understood, that was their desire at the time, at the end of their life, burn my stuff.
Okay.
It was very common.
Can you name some other noteworthy artists?
I can't name the artists themselves. I just know, like, I just finished 2 books. One was called The Night Travelers, and the other one was called My Last Innocent Life. And in both stories, there are brilliant artists who have this, and in other books that I have read, and in book discussions that I've been in, it's a common theme among very not understandable artists who are brilliant, because they're all a little meshuggah.
Well, it'd be interesting to know some details about that. Yeah, Maida, and then, well, we'll see if we have...
Wait, Maida. Wait.
I'm going back to the question about unfinished work. And I can speak only really to visual artists who often put something aside and said, oh, no good, hid it behind something. And 20, 30 years later, went back and reworked it once they had established who they were and what theirs.
You have some examples of that?
Oh, we can do almost anyone, but certainly Picasso.
Okay.
Certainly Renoir changed some of his paintings that
that's
later years.
Interesting.
There's just lots of artists who change what they're going to say when they're 20 as opposed to when they're 40
That's
or
interesting.
50.
Mahler, I think, was very famous
Yes.
for constantly
Yes.
editing his work.
Yes.
Yeah.
Whereas
Good.
Mozart never had the chance to do that.
Nor did it need any editing.
Do you want one more question, or are we
Is there?
wrapped up?
No? Are there others?
Are there any other questions? If not, I want to thank Rabbi Klein for giving us this fabulous afternoon together.
Thank you.
Sharing the background. You enriched our lives so much by having us understand such a complicated man.
Yeah.
And also understanding how Warhol interacted with that understanding or not understanding, and visually gave us such an incredible portrait that we could, as you said, continue the conversation, continue thinking about this, and having a really lively question and answer period of like, what do we think? The gallery is open now, and we invite you there. I also want to remind you that next Sunday at 3 o'clock, we have another program, Louis Brandeis, Passion Turned Legacy, and Rabbi Yael Dadoun from our congregation is going to be presenting to us next week at 3 o'clock, and we look forward to that, and we hope that you can join us. This is just a continuation of the programming that we're going to be learning together about these incredible personalities. So thank you, Jimena. Thank you, Rabbi Klein.
And there's some
And there's some cookies and things to eat on your way towards the gallery. Absolutely.